You know, in producing this series, there are many things that I have to do. The mechanical work on the cars, research, admin, chasing people, chasing parts, and all of the production work. But there's only one thing that I've found it very difficult to square away, and that has been, luckily only the 2 or 3 times that I have met someone who I was just really interested in, who I thought had a great story, and they just didn't want to be interviewed. Thankfully, it has never been anything against the series or me or any ill will or anything like that. It has just been a case of the preservation of privacy, and I can dig that, absolutely. Case in point, and the first of a parallel that's in this episode. There are 2 people like this in this episode. A man named Sean, a guy who's become a friend. He is a steel fabricator, a blacksmith, the son of a blacksmith. And in his yard, at the corner of his yard, I would warrant that most of the people who live in this area wouldn't even realise, is the building that was originally the forge of the community. It still stands there. I use Sean for a bit of welding now and then when I need something heavy welded, and I use him for steel. I get my steel from him, and I've been to him to get some steel because we're going to start a project in this episode that I'm very excited about. It was inspired by the project on the Vogue, and we will use it for that in the initial, but I have a feeling that it will become very, very handy later on throughout the series. So the Vogue is where this idea came from, and we should start there, and we will get to where we need to be. It's that kind of time of year where it's just so difficult to get back into the jobs that you need to do, and you'll find any other little thing to do to kind of procrastinate and stay away from the one that you know you should be doing. So the first thing I did back in the unit was I started tidying the place up, but in all fairness, with the best of intentions, things had fallen off a bit and the place had got quite messy. So back into the car, I finally decided, look, let's try and get the rails for this boot floor cut out, or what remains of them, and we'll get it prepped for the new ones. Before I could get these underfloor cross members out though, I had to release the brake lines and some wiring loom for the ABS out of the more forward one. These look like they've probably been replaced not so long ago, so the threads ran easy on them and it wasn't difficult to get them out. And out came these cross beams and the rest of the rails. So with those underfloor members out, the place is starting to look very stark, if quite a bit crusty. Now, this thing in the middle, we'll come back to this, but it's a Vogue Nivomat self-leveling strut. It's a very clever and very simple thing that allows you to maintain your ride height, amongst other things, even when you've got a lot of weight in the car. Just reconnecting the wires here to make sure that we don't lose track of what goes where. And the front of the car, initially, again, with the best of intentions, I had tried to protect the cab of the car by sealing it off with this plastic, but over the months it had fallen down and I either hadn't noticed or kept forgetting to put it back up, and the interior of the car is now in a very sorry state. But I know some people, and I can't decide whether they're dirt perverts or clean freaks, but one way or the other they are excited to get in here and give this a good going over, and they are very welcome to it. So that's all to come. Just a few little other bits and pieces to strip off the chassis. These are the rear belt anchor points from the base of the seats. And this is one of those times where time-lapse makes everything seem simple, but I must have spent an hour getting just these 2 simple bolts out. They were very badly stuck. But with those out, the first thing I did was go at the chassis just by hand with a wire brush. And then I remembered something way back, episode 1, I sheared a bolt on the rear seat base. Well, now I can get to it very easy, so I welded a nut onto the back of it, and it was still incredibly difficult to get out, but I got it out in one piece. And the good news is all those stainless fasteners that had been used to do that patchwork at the front, those plates, well, they fit in here, so we'll be able to replace all these bolts with nice stainless items. So down to the back of the chassis, I went to tackle these seized cross chassis bolts that hold on the brace bars for the tow bar. And I tried to put a bit of a weld onto them just to get heat into them, because I didn't think my butane torch would be enough, and the welding did nothing. So I started wailing on them with a hefty hammer and a punch, and again, not a sausage. So I went at them with the butane torch, and again, these were heated for a lot longer than it looks, and still nothing. Across to the offside, that sheared too on the outside of the chassis, but luckily it sheared inside the chassis rail slightly, which meant that when I was hammering it with the punch, at least it was easier to keep the punch centered. But once again, no cigar, so I moved away from this because it was just starting to soak up a lot of time. And I went to the chassis with a grinder and a very aggressive wire wheel on the grinder, and we're in far better shape now in terms of it being better prepped for paint. And look at all the dust in the air. I'm lucky to have some very understanding unit buddies. This unit is dusty at the best of times anyway, but locally I produce a hell of a lot of dust. You're now looking at the hardest working camera in the biz. This thing gets absolutely dog's abuse on a daily basis, and touch wood, it keeps going. This is actually the third attempt I made at getting these bolts out, and somebody on lr4x4.com, a Land Rover forum that I have been registered on since I got my first Range Rover, that's more than 10 years ago, but that I get to very seldomly, suggested, a guy called Ben, he said, look, zip into the tubes and it might release the tension on them from the rust, which I did. It took 2 zips on the offside and 3 on the near side, and finally these bolts came out, still with a hell of a lot of force and hammering, but I just welded the tubes back up, and I'll finish them up nicely later on. It was such a relief to get that done, and it had been such a chore that I had one of those end of the day kind of little bits of fun where I decided I'd test fit the tow bar this is all in aid of. It's a receiver hitch. This is a North American and Australian spec Land Rover receiver hitch. It's a factory item. It's rated just the same as any other Land Rover tow bar for 3,500 kilos towing capacity. The only difference is the brace bars are a little bit too short, so I took them back to Sean, got him to zip off the ends and lengthen them, and I drilled the holes up. Now, one of the last little things here I want to talk to you about that we will come back to again in more detail. I made my first attempt at sharpening a drill bit, and you see this drill bit here looks very pointy by comparison to a normal drill bit. That's because it has been used with excessive force and it's rounded. So I sharpened it, and it took a couple of goes, but it's a revelation to me being able to sharpen a drill bit. Even a broken drill bit potentially can be recut, which is really cool. I'll do a proper bit on that another time, but in the meantime, these brace bars went back on. This tow bar is now ready to go. I'll explain why I want this tow bar another time again, but for now, suffice to say, I just think it's very cool and I'm very happy it's back on. Now later, as I said, the reason I got the steel is related to the Range Rover, and we're going to start on a project. But first, we've got a non-starting Cortina to deal with. It was bright, but it was one of those horrible, wet, windy mornings when I came out to tackle the non-starting Cortina. But the show must go on, and I wasn't getting around without this car. I went at this with a good old-fashioned process of elimination. I checked for spark, it was fine. So I pulled off the airbox and pulled out the battery. Then I went to open the carb to check the fuel was getting in. But the weather took the first of its downturns of the day and I had to stop temporarily. A little bit later I managed to get the cover off the carburetor, and lo and behold, the float chamber was empty. Now this is just like the cistern in your toilet, and the float is like a stopcock. And what happens is the fuel comes up through the fuel line. While the float is low, the fuel can get in, but once the float chamber, this reservoir, fills up, the float closes the valve and stops the fuel getting in. So I checked the valve because they can stick closed, but it wasn't, it was working fine. So working backwards from the carb, I pulled the fuel line, which should have been full to the brim of fuel, and it wasn't. Following that down to the fuel pump, I released the cover of the fuel pump, and whereas a little bit of fuel came out, not nearly as much as what there should have been. So I knew the fuel wasn't getting to the pump even. Now I've serviced this pump already, I will show you that in another episode, but for now we were just trying to establish where this fuel was. I went old school and I did a little bit of old-fashioned siphoning on the pipe, and I could feel the fuel kind of pop and start moving down the pipe. It was an airlock, which I've never experienced with a petrol car. But happily enough, that's all it was. I left the pipe off, I took the HT lead off the coil and cranked the car until I saw the fuel coming out. Then I reconnected it, and after a few revolutions while the float chamber filled, the car started. It wasn't running perfectly, but that's because I had forgotten that I'd pulled a spark plug lead and not replaced it. So I put that back on and everything was tickety-boo. Now, this car definitely needs a rebuild. There have been some intermittent problems that I haven't mentioned, like she cut out the odd time coming down to a junction, some hesitations at speed, and generally being a little bit grumpy in the mornings when she was cold. Between myself and Rob, we've got a carburetor rebuild kit on order. It wasn't cheap, but then this carburetor, in the grand scheme of things, has a few extra things going on that the average carb doesn't. So we'll do that in a later episode and use it to learn exactly how a carburetor works. More from the cars, next episode. Some shout outs. Mickey DeSands is a man with a fleet of BMWs. He sent me some photographs. He has 5 E30s, 2 E36s, an E39, an E46, an F22. That is a 2 Series. I had to look that up. And an 850 IS. That must be a hell of a machine. And I reckon, Mickey, that you are a one-stop shop when we come to tackle the BMW story. So, you know, let's talk. Thanks a million for the photos, man. Dan Bai lives up a mountain in the States somewhere, and he has said that on occasion he's managed to freewheel his Porsche 914 60 miles down a mountain. I can just hear the hypermilers wetting themselves. Dan, thanks a million for the photos. I feel like we should cure you of the Impreza thing, only because it's too new for my taste, but it must be a hell of a daily driver. The person though that I want to send the kit to is a guy called Jeff Hodgson, and Jeff has something I would dearly love to get my hands on. He has a Series 1 Lotus Europa. That is the car, I believe, that they used the chassis from to develop the chassis of the Esprit. It was considered, I believe, as well, a supercar in its time. It was certainly a great performer, a mid-engine car, and possibly the first production mid-engine car. This is all stuff I'd love to be corrected on. Anyway, Jeff got this car, and the reason I want to send him the kit is because he didn't hang around. He just got straight into it. He has a build thread on Retro Rides. It's well worth a look. I will link it in the description. But Jeff's also a man after my own heart. He has Land Rovers and Lotuses. He has had a Defender. He's had a Discovery 2. His father has a Discovery V8 Series 1, and they had an awful mishap. He was towing the Discovery Series 1 on a trailer behind the Defender 90, and they lost the whole lot, which can't have been nice. Anyway, Jeff, the kit's on its way to you. I hope that you enjoy it between yourself and your dad, knock a bit of crack out of it, and expect it, mate, in the post. Okay, we are now going to talk about this project. We are going to build a sheet metal brake. That is a machine, depending on where you are, a sheet folding machine. It is for folding metal, for bending, putting bends in metal, and what we will use it for initially is to make new rails to hold the boot floor in the back of the Vogue. I'm very excited about this, but also there is an element of trepidation because it will require, you know, some decent measurements and to get some angles right and all that kind of thing. So anyway, here's the story. So how does a metal brake work? Well, it's just a very simple but robust machine. You slide in your piece of metal, you pull up the front face, usually manually, and it just makes a nice crisp bend in a piece of metal. Now, what you've got is a bed where the metal sits, then the top plate is called a clamping jaw or a clamping bar, and the bottom piece that you pull up is the folding leaf. This one is actually slightly smaller than we're going to go for. It's just over 4 foot, this one. We're going to go just over 5 foot so that we can fold, hopefully, sills for the 2-door Range Rover when we get to it. So what did I buy? Well, all of this steel is 6mm thick. The bigger bars are 80mm angle iron and they're about 6 foot long. The smaller bars are just about 5 foot long. Again, they're angle iron, but one is 80 and one is 60. I've also got a steel rod which is about 16mm in diameter and a tube, a piece of pipe that it fits very snugly into. The internal diameter is about 17mm. The last two pieces coming in are two sections of 120mm angle iron that I've cut down on one side to 60mm, and this is about 12mm thick, and two belt tensioners from what I believe is an Astra H or an Astra F, an Opel Astra. We'll see what these are used for later on. So the first thing to do is to mark up the sheets at the end, and we're going to cut out some sections here to let in the bar and pipe to make a hinge, because that's really all this machine is. Be careful with this kind of stuff. I've seen horrific pictures of people's faces with these grinding discs lodged in them. So when I broke this one, I got a proper fright. I really don't like doing it. I always try and concentrate. Now the cuts I made in these are terrible. They're only marginally straight. They're not very even from one side to the other, but that's just going to mean I'm going to have to work extra hard to get all of this square when I'm welding it up. So a test fit with the pipe, and it's good. So over to the bench. Now all of the measurements I made here are open to interpretation, but if you want the exact measurements I went to in the end, by all means get in touch and I'll give them to you. But these marks I've made in the pipe will make sections about 22mm each. I've decided on a 4-piece hinge, as in there will be 2 pieces of this tube on one side and 2 pieces of this tube on the other side. I beveled the edges just to make them a bit cleaner and look better, and these are now ready to be welded on. There was quite a bit of prep to be done on this pipe though, because this is a piece of welded pipe as opposed to extruded pipe, which means there is a seam in it, and on the inside usually you'll find the seam is slightly raised. I had to file this a little bit just so that the bar ran smoothly inside it. So with a final fettle on the cuts I made into the angle irons, this is now ready to be welded. In go the piece of tube, in goes the bar. Now I marked the bar across its center sections as a reference just so I could make sure I was getting everything lined up and true. I also marked the pipe on the end, so again I could get it level with the flat bed of the plate. The last thing I did just before I welded it was I let a couple of holes into the tube so it could be lubricated from time to time. Now if you're photosensitive, it might be a time to look away. For the first time I've left some of the welding in real time, and there is some flashing light coming up. Most of the welds are speeded up, but this one is in real time, just so you can see. And I feel like I understand the welding process a lot better having been able to weld continuously on this thicker piece of steel. So I'm eager again to start experimenting with what I'm doing on thinner sheet metal. I made a little boo-boo here. I welded both sides of one of the hinge sections. I caught it just before I was about to do a second one. Anyway, I ground that back, cleaned it up and went again. And miracle of miracles, this thing is actually working. This is a viable hinge. And the welds, they're certainly not the prettiest ever, but they're definitely not the worst either. What do they say about patting yourself on the back? Anyway, this thing is working. I am very, very happy. I need to reinforce it with some more welds on the underneath, but for now, I'm very excited that I got this far. Let's give it a try. I couldn't help myself. Now I've used a bullnose piece of plate here just to hold this metal down. It makes a more radius bend. It's a nice bend, but it just shows you the kind of versatility we can build into this machine later on if we so choose. And it works. This is going to be nice. We have to make the top clamping jaw. We have to make something for this to stand in, because I don't want to just take up a bench by clamping it to a bench. And we'll get into that the next time. I have some aspirations to make this thing pretty like an old piece of machinery, and we'll see about those the next time we visit this. I'm very much looking forward to finishing that tool. Now, something I've been waiting to bring into the episodes since the beginning, since episode 1, the previous owners of the Esprit. It's time. I tracked them down by Googling, making phone calls and handwriting letters, and I have been in contact with 4 or maybe 5 of the 10 original owners. I have met owners 2 and 3. so far, and they were great guys. But the first is a guy called Chris, a Ford dealer, a Ford main dealer for over 40 years in Lancashire in England. He just didn't want to be interviewed. He's the second parallel in the episode, and we had a great old chat. It's such a pity I couldn't interview him. He has had 18 Lotuses. He has had 9 Porsches. This Europa that you see in these photos, this is a before photo, this crash photo, and this one is the after. He repaired this car. He also had the last Europa ever built and made a plaque to put on the dash, so whoever has it should know it's the last Europa ever built. And if you do know anything about that car, give us a shout. He'd be keen to track it down. He told me that he had a cracked liner on the Esprit in his ownership. He only owned it for about a year, and it was only in its first year of ownership that he got it. So that was fixed by Lotus under warranty. He also had the steering wheel replaced, because when he bought the car, the steering wheel was broken, the rim was broken, and he reckoned that people must have, whoever was getting in and out of the car was putting too much pressure, pulling or pushing on the wheel, and literally ripped the rim off the body of the wheel. I had this fancy that I might be able to find the original wheel, that it might still be hanging in somebody's shed or something, but no, there you go. At least we know. He did something very, very cool. And I'm so lucky that Chris owned the car and that he had a dealership, because obviously Chris's paperwork is all in order. Chris has given me the original bill of sale to him from Sports Motors, where the car had originally been sold from. It went back there, or was sold through there again to him. He also gave me a brochure for the Lotus Esprit from 1978 and a price list from Lotus for 1979. So from a car that had lost all of its paperwork, we are starting to rebuild a history here, and that is just such a cool thing, and quite a rare thing, I would assume too. So from Chris's place, when I left, I went on a little bit of a pilgrimage. I went to a place, 250 Plymouth Grove in Manchester, the original site of Sports Motors, where the car was sold from. Sports Motors was well known, was owned by a man who was interesting in his own right, a guy called Rodney Bloor. He raced Lotus 23s, and maybe we'll get a story on him later on in the series. I didn't hang around too long. It's now some kind of a restaurant. You can still see the vague outline of the building, but I just wanted to see it for myself, and it was on the way to meet owner number 3, Ian Harbin, and we had a great old chat, myself and Ian. And I'm going to let this interview play a little bit more naturally than I usually would. I need to get myself a second mic so that I can make the interviews a bit more kind of two-sided, but bear with the sound in this one, and I hope you like it. Tell me your name and what you do, and then go into the Esprit.
Yeah, Ian Harbin, engineer, mechanical engineer. The Esprit was, I won't say one of the best cars I've ever had. It was a pain in the butt. Every time I got in it, there was something broke on it, and when I first bought it, I picked it up and the wipers burnt out. The wiper motor burnt out. And that was the first day I picked it up. So from there on, that's how the way it went. Never ending, always something wrong with it, always something wrong.
So what year did you buy it?
80, I think it was 80. 1980, it was a 79 the car, wasn't it?
78.
78, it was the first S2. One of the first S2s.
It was early, yeah.
Yeah, it was an early S2. And at the time I could have bought a Ferrari Dino or a 911 for the same money. But I stuck loyal to Colin Chapman.
Why?
Well, I had the Lotus Cortina, and Lotus were great at the time, weren't they? And it was the best looking car, but I think that was as far as it got, really. When it was running right, it was fantastic. Fantastic. You couldn't get better for road holding. It was down a bit on power, but you could make up with the handling.
Do you remember what you paid for it?
I paid maybe £10,000, 10,500. And that was a lot of money in those days. You could get a lot for that.
Were they hard to get?
They were, yeah. Well, I came across it. I went in Sports Motors, the Lotus agent in Manchester, looking for a JPS. But they didn't have one, and they didn't have any second-hand Esprits, but they gave me the name of Chris Trickett. So that's where they got it from. I phoned him up and went and had a look.
So he wasn't actually selling it.
He must have told the guys in Sports Motors that he was after selling it. So they put me onto him. And I was only home for a week, so I had to go and look at it, get it sorted, and buy it within the week. Because I was working overseas.
Where were you?
Saudi Arabia.
What were the things you remember that went wrong?
Oh, Driveshaft. The UJs on the Driveshaft. There was no grease nipples on them. So I put Ford Transit ones on with the grease nipple on it, and they lasted a bit longer. Wheel bearings. Used to eat wheel bearings. UJs, and the exhaust fell off. It sheared off at the manifold. So I had to have an exhaust made for it.
It sheared?
It sheared where the flange on the meets the manifold.
And do you remember who made that?
I had it done in Stockport, placed in Stockport. JP Exhaust, I think it was. They made the exhaust for it, a stainless steel one. Oil coolers, I put 2 oil coolers on it as well. Because of the place where it was, underneath at the back, all the stones catch it.
Did you have to do the wiper motor, did you?
Oh, about 6 times. I think it was like out of a mini miner or something like that, Austin miner. Something like that. The plastic gears used to shear.
You must have been going out in the rain a lot, were you?
It's Manchester, mate. Never stops raining.
I thought Ireland was the only place that...
No, it's like Ireland. It's like Ireland. Whatever it's doing in Ireland, it's doing here.
So how long did you keep it?
A couple of years. In fact, in the end, what I did, I bought an XJC so that I would have a car when I came home, because there was no saying that the Lotus would be running. I bumped it as well, actually.
Oh, it was you?
I ran into it. It was me. Driver's side front. It had a corner in it, yeah.
What did you have? How did that happen?
I hit a car. Ran into a car with it.
Were you giving it a bit of stuff?
No. I was sick, and the mind wasn't on it, and I just touched the car.
And what was the damage like?
It was just it cracked all the front corner, but I just got a new corner put on.
Who did that, do you remember?
Christopher Neal. They were the Lotus people. They were in Northwich, actually.
I've seen it, and there's only one spot underneath that you'd ever know.
You'd know, it was done properly. It was done properly.
And you don't have any photos of that damage, do you?
No, I didn't, no. I was well sick, so I didn't really take any pictures of it.
Yeah. Oh, you were...
It sickened me that I'd crashed the car, you know.
Okay.
I was devastated.
So you must have still loved it though, I mean...
I did. It was fantastic. The car was fantastic. But it was never running great for a long time, you know. There was always something. Even the heater radiator blocked up. The cam belt broke.
And you didn't completely kill the engine?
It bent maybe half the valves.
Because it's an interference engine.
Interference engine, yeah. And it had only done 15,000, 16,000 miles.
You're starting to worry me now. Well, as a mechanical engineer, let's say I do a top-notch rebuild on it. What do you reckon?
Oh, no problem. I did the head when the cam belt broke. I did it myself. So everything's easy to do on it.
Yeah, it's proper.
Yeah.
70s.
Yeah.
You reckon, is there any chance of being reliable, or do you think it's just...
Oh no, you could get it reliable now, because there's a lot more things available, better things available. Oils, exactly. Oils and the coolant. You can get better coolant now. You go chemical.
Some people would argue that it's not a supercar. What do you reckon?
Oh, it is. It is. The handling was fantastic. Fantastic. You could keep up with anything on the twisty roads. Definitely. Wherever you stopped, there was always a crowd around it. Because there weren't many of those cars about. And it's fantastic with the red leather. All red leather.
Yeah, what do you think of the fact that you've seen it?
I can't believe it. They've destroyed it. What would you think? What would bring that about?
I'm wondering whether maybe it got burned.
Or somebody stole the seats, or I don't know. Don't know. Couldn't imagine.
And the crazy thing is, if you examine it, it's a really good quality retrim. It's just horrible.
Yeah, horrible, terrible.
Yeah.
I put conies on it as well, coney front shock absorbers.
Did it make a difference?
Yeah, it was a lot better.
Somebody has the American spec front springs on it, so the American Federal cars were higher to make
is
so
it?
the lights.
Yeah.
And it looks just like this.
It looks too high.
It's just a mess around.
Yeah. Well, I've got the photographs and it's perfect.
Unless you have anything, is there anything that he...
No. Just a beautiful...
No, she's sat in the car while we've been broken down, waiting for the A8 to come in.
Yeah.
Not far from here, near Alton Park, the racetrack.
Very good.
And in the end, I got fed up of waiting for him and I fixed it myself.
Oh, that's when the...
It was a fuel filter. Fuel filter, the fuel wasn't passing through the filter.
So, do you attribute your marriage to it?
Oh, yeah. It tested us anyway, didn't it?
Yeah.
Do you don't have fond memories of it now?
Yeah, it was a lovely car. It was a lovely car.
Beautiful.
You didn't have it very long one side, mate, did you?
No, because I had to save up for a house then, so there's no way I could spend the money like I was spending on the Lotus and buy a car, and have a house as well. There's no way.
What was the attitude towards Lotus here?
Everybody adored Lotus. Fantastic. Had a great name for itself with the racing, with the JPS. Because that was the time when John Player Specials were winning everything.
And do you think the loss of Chapman was the end of it?
I would say so, yeah. But it's coming up now. It's coming good now, isn't it? It's coming good. It was the quality was terrible. The build quality, it was terrible. Really was.
It's unfortunate that because all the car manufacturers use parts from their other, like the sub brands and stuff.
Yeah.
Those are the only ones that get pinned for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because the Jag I had was full of different things,
The Porsches have Volkswagen stuff in them. Yeah, they do.
No.
Yeah, they do.
No. I've got a 997 GTS in the garage, and it's all Porsche, mate. Awesome.
Yes, sir,
Yeah.
yeah. So the one inside is just the daily.
The daily.
We'll have to have a quick look.
Yeah, no worries, mate. And red leather. Again.
Oh, yeah.
I was that impressed with the Lotus leather. Really good. Really good.
Too many toys.
Riddle me this, Batman. Is a classic Lotus a gateway drug to a Porsche? Why are the two dyed-in-the-wool Lotus guys driving Porsches? I didn't ask them. I figure that's a whole can of worms for another day. We will meet these guys again. I think I might be biased. What do you think? Is our little Silver Esprit absolutely gorgeous? The panel gaps are a little bit all over the place, but that's something that we can fix if we so deem it necessary. Anyway, before I say anything else, anything that you can do to get Soup out there is a big deal. I don't do kind of sensationalized thumbnails and titles, probably to the detriment of the series. It leaves me definitely on the back foot in terms of how the system works, but it means that I rely heavily on you to get Soup out there. So liking each episode that you watch, watching the episode when it comes out, sharing it with your friends, getting other subscribers, anything, all of that stuff, it's really important. The other little idea is something I've done. If you go onto a car portal or read a car magazine or go on a forum, often there's an email address, a tips email address or an editor's email address where you can send recommendations. So if you have somewhere you go for other car stuff and you can find an email address like that, please do recommend Soup. It will make a difference. Okay, to my patrons, Andrew Weaver, Bo Morrow, Dan Bai, ED, Kevin Miller, Raz Hussein, Roland Crowell, Sean Clark, Stephen Daly, Chris Stoddart, Min O'Cal, Andrew Dalton and Romantas Radziunas are all new patrons. Mark Wellnitz, Sam Taylor, Sean Dubois, Mickey Dusanz, Ricardo Aguilo, Peter Sarbut, Matt B, and there is one more, I know there is, Andrew Nicholson, all up their pledges. Gents, you know, I'm not on Sound Foundation just yet, but so long as you are here, so am I, so thank you so much. It makes such a difference and you are keeping me going. Okay, that is it for episode 18. I will be back to 2 episodes a month from here on in. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Good luck.